Metroidvanias, a genre descriptor which is really sort of incomplete when you think about it. Sure, the concept of having a large game world which gradually opens up to you as you gain new abilities was made popular, if not straight up pioneered, by games like Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, hence the coining of the portmanteau. But to name just one example, a lot of the Legend of Zelda games make use of the trope as well. In fact, it could be argued they did it first, with the first Zelda game being released half a year before the first Metroid, so really shouldn't the genre be called, I don't know, Metroid Zeldavanias? Legend of Metroidvanias? No? Anyway, no matter what you want to call them, that's what we're looking at today, and it took a lot of backtracking and scrounging for every max health increase I could find, but I did manage to find a few examples.
First, we'll be running and gunning on a seemingly abandoned alien planet in And All Would Cry Beware. Next, it's a charming-looking 8-bit entry to the genre, ALWA'S Awakening. And if you don't like any of those choices, well, we could always have a redo.
Here we have a game that was originally slated for the very first episode of this series, where I took a look at a bunch of platformers. Since at first glance, CATSBY appears to be nothing more than a basic Kirby clone, with its Game Boy-esque graphics, puffball-looking main character, and different abilities said character can use. It wasn't until I played the game that I realized it actually has more in common with the Metroidvania than the standard run-and-jump platformer.
Sticking with the aesthetics for the moment, CATSBY has a chiptune soundtrack to match the retro graphics, which does sound nice, don't get me wrong, but it is incredibly limited. Not counting the main menu theme, there's one song that plays when looking at the map/pause menu, another for boss battles, and one more that plays in every other room in the entire game, or at least what I played of it. The only reason I'm not complaining more about it is because it's actually a pleasant enough tune to listen to, which, despite its repetitive nature, doesn't really outstay its welcome.
So on the surface, CATSBY appears to be quite the charming platformer, but don't underestimate it. The 8-bit look isn't the only thing it shares with the Game Boy era. It's got the difficulty to match. And unfortunately in this case, that's not a good thing, since here much of the difficulty comes from gameplay elements which are frustrating when they really don't need to be. How frustrating? Well... No!
First, let's take the checkpoints, and I use that term deliberately since while they serve the same basic function as a save point in any other Metroidvania, i.e. saving your progress and refilling your health and magic, in CATSBY very few of them are in what could be called a dedicated save room. Instead, the majority of the checkpoints are out in the open, more often than not with enemies too close by for comfort. Which leads to my next point. The hitbox detection here is just... off. CATSBY himself is inconsistent as to when he wants to hit enemies, particularly with the sword and hammer abilities. Both weapons have an overhead swing animation. However, with the sword, enemies can be hit at any point during that animation, but with the hammer, even if the hammer sprite seems to make contact with an enemy, it won't actually hit unless the hammer is in front of CATSBY. As for CATSBY's own hit detection, there have been plenty of times when I've been hit by an enemy despite CATSBY's sprite being nowhere near what supposedly hit him.
Also adding to the frustration is something I didn't even realize until I began writing the script for this segment. In the 7 hours I played and roughly 40% of the map I uncovered, I didn't come across a single teleporter. Meaning if you're, say, midway through the game and you get an ability that finally lets you get an item near the beginning of the game that you couldn't get before, if you still want that item, you've got to carry your ass all the way back to the start to get it, and then all the way back to where you were, all the while dodging monsters that can apparently hurt you without touching you, as well as insta-death spike traps, which, yes, by the way, they will kill you if you touch the side of them because fuck you, with checkpoints that are too few and far between.
Oh, and if you want to talk about
inconsistency,
I knew I'd get more use out of that clip sooner or later. Let's talk set pieces. Credit where credit's due, the world in general looks great for an 8-bit-esque monochrome pixel art game, but it's like the map designer couldn't make up their mind whether a set piece should be dangerous from room to room. Note this pillar here in this underwater section. Note how I fall through it if I try to stand on it. So naturally, when I see that very same pillar in this room, and directly over a spike trap no less, I'm jumping around like I swallowed a pogo stick trying to avoid it while at the same time throwing a bomb at these bombable blocks. Except as it turns out you can stand on this pillar, because of course you can, why would you think otherwise? Hey, let's play a fun little game. Spot the difference between these two statues. Go on, I'll give you a few seconds.
inconsistency, 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 inconsisten
That's right, there's absolutely no difference between these two statues whatsoever. Except this one will kill your ass if you get too close. But hey, at least the controls are rebindable. At least some of them are. The pause menu lists controls for movement, jumping, and attacking, which you can set to whatever you want. However, for whatever reason, you cannot change Q and E, which cycle through your abilities, the number keys, which select each individual ability, or the tab key, which brings up a hotkey listing, which I activated inadvertently way too many times because, hello, when it comes to PC games, I'm sorry, but you say tab and I say map. But hey, at least CATSBY is playable with the gamepad. I think. The game itself doesn't seem too sure about that. To clarify, the gamepad does work. Movement is handled with either the D-pad or left stick, but rather than A being jump and B attacking, the two are reversed, which threw me off. What's the problem, you ask? Just rebind them, you say? I'd love to! Show me how. There's no obvious way to apply gamepad prompts to the key bindings in the menu, which would almost make you think the game was developed strictly with the keyboard in mind and the gamepad working is just a happy accident, except that whenever you gain a new ability, you're automatically shown a demo of how to use it, with prompts for the gamepad rather than the keyboard. Oh, and if you're about to tell me you can set the gamepad bindings in the launcher, said launcher has about 37,000 prompts in it. My gamepad only has so many buttons.
The more I played CATSBY, the more I struggled to find anything fun about it. I think the only thing I can truly say I enjoyed were the boss battles. They actually provided some true challenge, which was refreshing when, again, much of the game's difficulty was just due to needless frustration, and they felt so satisfying when you eventually learn their patterns and defeat them. Sadly, however, the boss fights are just a small part of a game which is physically exhausting to put up with. My last straw was in this room, where I ducked under a large, swinging, spiked ball with plenty of headroom between me and it, yet it still hit me several times. I mean, seriously, look at this. How is that hitting me? CATSBY should have been a charming throwback to gaming's yesteryear. Instead, all it succeeded in doing was driving my anxiety through the roof and reaffirming my belief that cats are assholes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need a palate cleanser. And I think I know just the game. When the Kickstarter was announced for Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night in 2015, everyone who had even so much as heard of Castlevania's Symphony of the Night perked their ears up. A spiritual successor to one of the greatest games of all time, and made by the same guy? Hell yes, sign me up! For years we waited, and we even got royally teased in 2018 with a callback to the Castlevanias of the 8-bit era in the form of Bloodstained: Curse of the Moon. Eventually, Ritual of the Night was released, and eventually I played it, and it was alright. I don't think the hype did it any favors for me though, because don't get me wrong, it was a good game in and of itself, but it didn't quite scratch that Symphony of the Night itch like I hoped it would. Quite unlike this game, TIMESPINNER.
I should mention this is not the first time I've played TIMESPINNER. I first live-streamed it back in March, and I had just as much fun playing it for this second go-around as I did the first time. In fact, writing this review was a bit of a challenge, since there are so many things the game does right, it was hard to pick and choose just what to talk about in such a limited time frame. I mean, the soundtrack is superb, the environments are gorgeous, the sprite animations are so incredibly detailed and fluid. TIMESPINNER is also one of the most open and inclusive games I've seen in terms of how it portrays the sexuality and gender identity of its protagonists in a way that doesn't feel just tacked on like an afterthought, with Linnaeus, the character the player controls, being portrayed as a lesbian, and the group of rebels that she befriends consisting of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender characters. It's a bold move that truly pays off in my opinion. Now, one of the determining factors of any good Metroidvania is, of course, the combat, and that of TIMESPINNER is one of the most versatile takes on the mechanic I've seen in a game thus far. Your main attack is done via a pair of floating orbs, one controlled by each hand. The first orbs you get are good for a simple, basic melee attack, but as you progress through the game, you get more orbs with different abilities, such as a sword attack or a spark of plasma energy. And as you obtain different orbs, you can choose which one you use in each hand. But it doesn't stop there. One of Linnaeus' friends can craft special jewelry for you, in the form of rings, which either give your orbs additional properties like fire damage, or in some cases will give you other benefits like damage protection or revealing secret passages, and necklaces, which allow you to charge up a devastating special attack at the cost of aura energy, this game's equivalent to MP. She can also directly level up the orbs themselves, increasing their base damage. Couple all of that with an item you get a couple of rooms over, which allows you to save up to 3 different layouts of orbs, rings, and necklaces, and you have a combat system with a virtually limitless amount of variety. As the game's title suggests, there are also time mechanics involved as well. Not only can you jump between 2 time periods for much of the game, But Linnaeus can also stop time for a limited period, determined by her sand power, for which, like her health and aura energy, she can find max increases throughout the map. While time is stopped, Linnaeus can neither deal nor take damage, but she can use enemies as makeshift platforms to get to otherwise inaccessible areas. Plus, it's essential in the boss fights, as each boss has at least one attack that requires the use of time stopping to avoid it. And while we're on the subject of the bosses, every single one was a joy to fight. Not one of them felt unfair or overly frustrating.
During the research stream, one of my patrons brought up the fact that the bosses in TIMESPINNER have no health bar or any other visual indicator as to how close they are to dying. And it's true, the lack of a health bar could be a potential problem if handled incorrectly. On the other hand, I could think of at least one other game that didn't have boss health bars. Sorry. But in both cases, the boss fights were interesting and engaging, and your focus was always on avoiding the boss's attacks, learning their patterns, exploiting their weaknesses, and mastering the fight. And in each case, you always felt like you could do it. Even if you died, you just needed to get better. Neither game really needed a health bar for the bosses because there was never that sense of, is this fight almost over? Why is he not dead yet? What more do I have to do? When can I leave? If I'm having to focus more on a health bar than the boss itself, then that's more than likely a problem with the design of that boss, and thankfully that problem doesn't exist here.
Obviously, every game has its flaws, and while TIMESPINNER is no different, any negatives I could find were more minor personal nitpicks than major gameplay concerns. For instance, when looking at the map, you can place markers wherever you want. Cool! However, you can't make any notes with the markers, which more often than not led to be backtracking to the room I marked to see why I marked it, thus rendering the markers effectively useless. Also filed under effectively useless for me were the familiars. Each one of them has their own unique ability in addition to a standard melee attack, and they increase their damage as they level up. However, they only gain experience if you kill an enemy they've already attacked, and the way I play, when I enter a room and a familiar starts attacking the first enemy we see, by the time it's finished, I've already killed the other 10. To stay with the familiar and wait for it to attack each and every enemy, which can sometimes take a few seconds, severely breaks the otherwise smooth flow of the gameplay, which is why I usually had a familiar out for looks more than anything else.
Even with those small gripes, TIMESPINNER is an example of a Metroidvania done damn near perfectly, and you should waste no time whatsoever in picking it up. And while you're at it, grab the soundtrack too. It is well worth the extra $10, believe me. Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night kicked the Metroidvania genre into high gear. So much so to the point that nowadays when you hear the term Metroidvania, chances are the first thing that comes to mind is a 2D pixel art side-scrolling affair. But some of my favorite games, in general, not just in the genre, are those of the Metroid Prime trilogy, which combines the concept of exploration being tied to your equipment with some good old-fashioned classic FPS action. So I was curious as to whether there were any PC games that emulated this style. Sure enough, while browsing through Steam to compile a list of games to cover for this video, I stumbled upon And All Would Cry Beware, which, while slightly lower res than the Prime games, nonetheless promises that same blend of Metroidvania and FPS action. Plus, I had to pick it up just on the name alone. I mean, it sounds so badass.
Titular badassery aside, is the game worth a damn? Or at the very least, worth the $10 asking price? In a word, not really. Cry Beware has a minimal story, told mostly through log entries found throughout the world. Following along with the entries is not all that easy, as there are no breaks between each character's lines, and the text size varies from page to page, both factors which make the log entries harder than necessary to read. Plus, the story has a plot twist which, much like the dome you see in the distance near the beginning of the game, you can see coming a mile away. Oh, and speaking of tiny visual elements, check out the game's HUD. If you look really, really closely, you can just make out the health bar.
I can understand trying to keep HUD elements out of the player's way. I mean, low-budget gaming viewers will no doubt remember how I gave flack to Galaxy Ranger Luna for having the exact opposite problem with its HUD, but this is too far in the other extreme.
The game can be played with either keyboard and mouse or gamepad, but you'll want to go with the former for this one. The free look on the gamepad was too slow, and nothing I fiddled with in the settings seemed to change that. Keyboard controls are nice and standard. WAS and D for movement, space for jump, E to interact, left click to fire your weapon, and you can cycle through those weapons with either the mouse wheel or number keys. Don't bother trying to bring up the map though, because there ain't one. Which I'm fairly sure is a cardinal sin of Metroidvanias.
So, how about those weapons? I mean, since we're on an alien planet, I can only imagine the kind of exotic weaponry we're gonna get our hands on. I mean, like maybe a laser that penetrates through multiple enemies, or a lightning gun. A gun that shoots lightning. I mean, imagine that. Or maybe a
pistol, shotgun, machine gun, rocket launcher.
What is this, Call of Duty?
I mean, yeah, to be fair, the weapons do accomplish the job you'd expect them to do in a Metroidvania, that being to increase your arsenal while simultaneously granting you access to new areas. Specifically, the shotgun blasts away vine walls, the machine gun is the only weapon that can break down whatever the hell this is supposed to be, and the rocket launcher gets rid of any piles of boulders in your way.
I mean, seriously, what is it with first-person shooters in futuristic sci-fi settings that insist on using plain old bullet weapons? If I wanted bullet weapons, I could play Medal of Honor. A game like this is your chance to show off your imagination and dream up weapons no one's ever seen before and absolutely wow your audience. Bullet weapons in sci-fi games is a tired trope that I'm tired of seeing, and quite frankly, if this game can't do any better than that...
Fire orb.
Wait, what?
So yeah, apparently one of the scientists that was stationed on this planet before you arrived just one day up and went, "Oh yeah, by the way, I'm a wizard," and put a tiny portal to a dimension that's perpetually aflame into an orb of stone, and crafted the fire orb. So hey, now at least we have more variety in the weapons. Except that the fire orb, or as I like to call it, enemy? What enemy? Absolutely breaks the game. Apart from the pistol, which you pick up very early on, it's the only weapon you don't have to fight a boss to get. You use it to burn these thick thorns away, and as far as combat goes, its flames have a limited range, but once you get an enemy into that range, most of them are no longer a problem within half a second. Even the final boss is an absolute joke when introduced to the fire orb. There are checkpoints, but much like CATSBY, they're generally out in the open. Plus, if you die and respawn at a checkpoint, almost everything in the world resets, meaning enemies you killed and barriers you destroyed will have to be dealt with again.
Lastly, Cry Beware is incredibly short for a Metroidvania. Coming into the game completely blind, it took me less than an hour and a half to beat it. Now, I've said before, I don't mind short games if the overall experience is enjoyable and satisfying. Unfortunately, however, neither one of those terms can really be applied here. When all were crying beware, they meant beware of this game. I actually had a different game planned for this segment, but then one day I was browsing through Twitter and I noticed a post from a company called Elden Pixels, stating that a game they were developing was, at the time, 60% funded on Kickstarter. Said game was called ALWA'S Legacy, and the reason it caught my attention in the first place was because an earlier game in the same universe, ALWA'S Awakening, had already been in my wishlist for some time. In fact, its $10 price tag means it was on a list of potential games to cover for low-budget gaming once that goes back into production. But at the time of this video, I still don't know when that'll be, so going on that classic logic of if it's got a sequel coming, it must have done something right, I decided to look at this instead of what I had originally lined up.
So, ALWA'S Awakening then. Gotta say, I'm actually a little conflicted on this one. We'll get into why later. Let's talk details first. A long time ago in the realm of ALWA, a being called Vicar, along with his 4 teenagers with attitude, his protectors, ransacked a village called Darkmoon and made off with 4 sacred ornaments called, the Ornaments. For years afterward, nothing happened. Then I guess the Darkmoon villagers finally decided they wanted to decorate their Christmas tree again and so would quite like their ornaments back. Trouble is, they apparently all suck at the whole hero thing, so a girl named Zoe is magicked into the realm from who knows where, and it's up to her to bring down Vicar and return the ornaments. So what skills and weapons does our heroine have at her disposal for the task at hand? When you first start out, precisely nothing. She can't attack, she can't cast a spell, hell, she can't even freaking swim. However, it doesn't take long before Zoe picks up a wand which she can use for a melee attack. And eventually she finds 3 colored gemstones that can be set into the wand to give her the requisite Metroidvania get-to-new-areas type abilities, each of which drains Zoe's magic meter, preventing further ability use until it refills over time. The green gemstone creates a block which lets you reach platforms that are just out of reach for Zoe's regular jump and can be used to weigh down any green switches you find. The blue gemstone creates a bubble that serves as an elevator for a short time before it bursts, and the yellow gemstone lets you fire a burst of energy which opens these doors with a lightning bolt and doubles as a magic attack. Now the game tells you that the lightning bolt uses more magic power, but that's not technically accurate. It completely drains your magic meter like the other abilities, however the meter takes longer to recharge after using the lightning spell. You can also find upgrades for the green and blue gemstones as well, which allow you to push your magic block into water and ride across the surface, and remove the time limit from your bubble elevator. I would have thought there would be an upgrade for the yellow stone as well, but I never found it in my playthrough, and a brief glance across the interweb would seem to suggest that there isn't one. Beyond the wand and magic spells, Zoe herself doesn't have all that much to speak of in terms of abilities. In fact, the limitations placed on her seem a bit arbitrary almost. In addition to her aforementioned inability to swim, she can't attack while ducking. She has a very limited health bar as well, just 3 hits and she's down. There aren't any ways to increase her max health per se, however, once she obtains this flask, she can fill it with water using wells which are placed in a few locations throughout Alwa, which will give her health bar a one-time refill if she takes an otherwise fatal blow from an enemy. Most environmental hazards will still kill her outright though. I was prepared to also criticize her slow movement speed, but then I realized that this, combined with her variable jump height depending on how long you hold the button, and the fact that you can change direction in midair, actually makes for very precise platforming. Even so, if you're not using a warp point, which ALWA'S Awakening thankfully has, it can take longer than I'd like to get from point A to point B. I think some kind of dash or other such minor speed boost wouldn't have gone amiss here.
ALWA'S Awakening seems to pass almost all the criteria of the Metroidvania checklist. Large, wide-open world you explore as you gain new abilities, warp points, dedicated save rooms, a map which is actually very user-friendly in that if you die and you get sent back to a save room, any progress you made on the map before dying is still saved, although I kind of wish you could make notes on it. Even with all the gripes I mentioned, I could find nothing heinously wrong with the game. So why did I say I was conflicted at the start of the segment? I just don't know. About the game. That is, not why I'm conflicted. I'm conflicted because I don't know. Let me try this again.
I played this game for roughly 8 hours, and I think it's fair to say I enjoyed what I played of it. I certainly didn't hate it. But for some reason, this game just didn't click with me. In fact, much of the time I spent writing this part of the script consisted of me staring at a blank screen, struggling to put it into words, and yeah, I got nothing. Sure, I didn't absolutely love the game, but I didn't ever really not want to play it either. It's rare that a game has this effect on me, but the best I could say is I just don't know how to feel about ALWA'S Awakening.
But I realize that's not exactly all that helpful for what is supposed to be a review, so to try and put a definitive cap on it, while I won't be playing the game again anytime soon, I do still think it scores just enough points in its favor for me to recommend trying it yourself. After all, you might have better luck connecting with it than I did. And I will still be keeping an eye on its sort of sequel ALWA'S Legacy. Who knows, maybe it'll have a trick or two up its sleeve to get me more excited about playing it than Awakening did. We appear to be bookending this video with exercises in frustration. Recall that in CATSBY's case, I tried my best to put up with all the bullshit that game's needless frustrations had to offer, but in the end decided it just wasn't worth my time. So what would make me want to soldier through the frustrations of yet another game? Well, a compelling story would certainly help, and thankfully that's one thing that our last game, Redo, would seem to have in its favor.
And to be fair, Redo isn't quite as frustrating as CATSBY, but it still has its points, which we'll get to in due time. We open with our nameless heroine musing to herself about the fact that she appears to still be alive, though evidently, as we see a short time later, it ain't for lack of trying. Indeed, not a world overflowing with rainbows and happiness is the setting for Redo. Instead, it's a dystopian post-apocalypse permeated by a dense fog, and our heroine is the last surviving human in this world. Or at least, so she had been led to believe, until she received a message shortly before the game opens, which could possibly be from another human, instructing her to meet them at the top of a place called the Solar Cathedral. From there, the game sends you on your way, gradually introducing you to the mechanics with tutorial messages as you explore the early rooms. Once again, the game can be played with either keyboard and mouse or gamepad, and either setup works perfectly fine and have rebindable keys, and the button prompts automatically update if you switch methods mid-game. I personally went with the gamepad for most of my playthrough.
There's an intricately woven amount of strategy to the combat of Redo. It's not just a matter of running into every room and thwacking anything and everything you see. In fact, in the early part of the game, that's actually a good way to get yourself killed.
All enemies have 2 numbers over their head. The larger white one is their health, but the smaller blue one is where things get interesting. I don't think the game ever gives it an actual name, but I'm going to call it their stamina. Like their health, it drains when you attack an enemy, but in some instances an enemy can drain it themselves with their own attacks. If their stamina reaches 0, they are temporarily stunned while their stamina meter slowly counts back up to its max. During this time, your attacks deal more damage, and if you kill an enemy while they're stunned, they'll drop health orbs, but only if they're stunned. Otherwise, they'll only drop energy pickups, which are used for your special attacks. Speaking of those special attacks, they come in the form of mostly offensive gadgets, though there are a couple made more for defense, which you make use of by assigning them to one of 3 slots in your hotbar. While most of the gadgets are there purely for combat use, a few also help you get around the environment, like the taser, which activates electrical switches, and the hand cannon, which destroys any small stone statues in your way. Each ability uses a different amount of energy, indicated in the lower right corner of its icon, and when you first start out you have a very limited energy pool. And while your own melee attack is good, here in Redo the enemies themselves are no pushovers either, and that's where the strategy comes into play. Low on health? How desperate are you? Are you brave enough to want to wait till an enemy is stunned and get what precious few health drops it gives you? Maybe you're just low on energy, or an enemy is simply in your way, so you want to eliminate them as quickly and efficiently as possible. Maybe you just don't feel like fighting and want to bypass as many enemies as you can.
At this point, you're probably thinking this is shaping up to be quite a glowing review, and the game doesn't sound that frustrating at all. Unfortunately, this is the part where I have to say, not so fast. Because for every one thing Redo does right, it bungles something else up entirely. Here's some examples.
Dedicated save rooms are present and accounted for in Redo. Cool. Except there's only 4 of them in the entire game, which, by the way, only has a single save slot. And like many areas in the world, they're not easy to find your way to, because just like Cry Beware, Redo has no map. Now I know I sort of jokingly chided Cry Beware about it earlier, but seriously, not including a map in your Metroidvania is senseless. Especially when a lot of the screens in the game look identical, to the point where I kept going in circles trying to remember where to go, and in some cases I just said, screw it, and died on purpose just to warp back to a save room and be somewhere different. Plus, a map is more than just a tool to help players navigate. It also serves as a reminder of what a player still needs to do, especially if you put the game down and come back to it after a day or two. Let's go back to the special abilities. For the longest time, the thing that impeded my progress the most was these blue stone statues, so much so that I needed to find a walkthrough for help. And I was not pleased when I found that help either. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the hand cannon is the thing that destroys them, but A, look at the hand cannon's description. How the hell are you supposed to know from this that it destroys statues? And B, why is the hand cannon the only thing in your arsenal that can destroy them and not, oh, I don't know, your freaking rocket launcher? Also, you know that limited resource that Redo Girl uses for special attacks? The one I've referred to up till now as energy? Well, the game actually refers to it by a specific name, one which you've probably already guessed if you've paid attention to the HUD. They're actually called bullets, which just raises more questions about the weapons themselves. For one thing, about half of the special weapons are things which wouldn't use physical bullets or any kind of projectile for that matter, like the energy sword and the riot shield. I mean, look at this. How does this use a bullet? Plus, some of the gadgets have a short wind-up to their animations, making it possible for an enemy to interrupt your attack. So if the attacks are using bullets, how are they still being expended if it's interrupted?
There are other questionable design choices I could talk about, like the fact that neither menu pauses the game, or the red versions of some of the enemies and just how mishandled I thought they were. But this segment's starting to run long, and I still want to talk about what I thought the major disappointment was for Redo: the story. Yeah, I know I said at the start that it seemed to have that in its favor, and the promise that it showed was, in all honesty, the only reason I kept going through a game that I otherwise wouldn't have played anywhere near as long.
When the game starts, the only thing we know for sure about Redo Girl is that she's the only remaining human, or at least so she thinks, and as a result she's suffering from severe depression, enough to have attempted suicide at least once, probably more. Then we learn of the message directing her to the Solar Cathedral, and you as the player want to help her get there just as much as she wants to know if there really is someone else out there. The game even teases you with both bits of backstory as to how the world got into the state it's in now, and occasional reminders of your goal from TV screens and dilapidated payphones. This is why I wanted to power through the game, and why I considered the frustration a bit more justified here than it was in CATSBY. It's as if the game is taunting you, saying to you, hey, you want answers? Try and get them. And you just want to pick up the gauntlet the game throws down and use it to slap the game in the face and earn that happy ending for Redo Girl. Then you get to the end, and you find this. Clearly not a human, so you might think we're gearing up for a sad ending, which is fine. I can take sad endings too if they're properly built up to. But we've never seen or heard of whatever the hell this thing is supposed to be before now, and even though we get a shit ton of speech from Redo Girl, we get no explanation about it whatsoever. It doesn't even say anything to her, which Redo Girl remarks is because it can't understand her, and if that's true, how the hell did it send the message which Redo Girl had no problems understanding at the beginning of the game in the first place? Then you get the choice of 2 endings. I use the quotes because they end the game in exactly the same way, by jumping to the credits, only with the added benefit of a gunshot sound should you choose the shoot ending.
Getting to the end of the game unlocks New Game Plus, except it's not a New Game Plus because you don't get to keep any of your items. Instead, their locations are just changed. From what I've read online, this seems to be considered more or less the game's hard mode, and there is a little more to the ending, but not much, and it still doesn't answer the major questions that the game posed at the start. I genuinely wanted to like Redo. It had so much potential to be a challenging and moving experience. But it threw that potential away with poor design choices and an ending which needlessly raised more questions than it answered. That'll do it for this episode of QuickTime Event. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have an idea for a theme for a future episode or know of a game that I missed in the themes I've covered thus far, get in touch with me on Twitter or Discord. Links in the description. Which I assume you can still see on Twitch, because, yeah, in case you missed the news, I'm not on YouTube anymore for various reasons, and I'm still kind of feeling my way around uploading on Twitch. In fact, if you can't see the links or there is no description, tell you what, there we go. Put them on that screen, now we're covered. And also, this is getting released in December. Hopefully, fingers crossed. I mean, what you're seeing right now is like the 4th or 5th time I've had to reshoot the camera segments alone. But anyway, this is hopefully getting released in December, so let me take the time to wish each and every one of you a very Merry Christmas, if indeed you observe and celebrate it, and a Happy New Year, and I will see you in 2020. Chikai mare. Sayonara.